Hey, what's up? Welcome to newsletter number 8. This is for January 7th, 2022. This is Andrew Cooper Sansone, and if you didn't see the one last week, well, Happy New Year. This is technically the first newsletter of the new year, so I hope you have a lot of good things to look forward to this year. I'm not going to belabor this intro too much because every week we have a fact about your brain or mind, a science based happiness or productivity tip, a book recommendation, a quote, and my thoughts about life, culture, current events, or news about the channel. So anyway, I want to thank you so much for being a part of this community and for making this newsletter possible. So, something that I want to make you aware of is that pretty soon we are going to be making this newsletter into a podcast. So, as a newsletter subscriber, you will still get exclusive access to the video versions of all these newsletters, but the audio will be available as a podcast on all the major podcast networks like iTunes and Spotify, Google, all those. So that is actually going to be happening this week. So there are going to be all the previous 7 newsletters uploaded as the audio as podcasts, and then this one will be the newest one, really. So that will be starting this week. So if you prefer to listen on audio, you can find the podcast, and that is going to be called the Thinking Tools Podcast from Sense of Mind. So it is just the same thing as the newsletter, but you don't get the video version if you don't sign up for this newsletter. This newsletter also contains notifications for new videos that we're putting out. And by the way, we will be having a new series of videos to add on to the neuroscience course, the kind of intro to neuroscience course that I've been constructing over the last few months. And these will be on serotonin, the neurotransmitter serotonin. They're going to be in a new format and a new style for what we usually do on the channel. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think it's just going to improve the viewing experience. So anyway, that is all for this week in terms of news. Let's get to the first thing, which is the fact about the brain. This one has to do with how your brain times intervals between events. And actually, this whole newsletter, this whole episode is going to be about time in the brain, in the mind. And it's centering on a book called Your Brain is a Time Machine by Dean Buonomano, which is a fantastic book. I'll talk more about that later. If you've ever wondered how your brain tells time, how it keeps track of durations, and how it's able to accomplish feats of timing like those involved in dancing or playing a musical instrument, then be ready for a lot of answers to that question. This week's newsletter is all about time and how the brain keeps track of it, a topic that came from this week's book recommendation, Your Brain is a Time Machine by neuroscientist Dean Buonomano. Now, Buonomano's main thesis is what he calls the multiple clocks principle, which states that the brain uses many different neural circuits and networks to accomplish various feats of timing and to keep track of time at different scales, from milliseconds to years, rather than a single master clock. I'll describe the book in more detail later, but for now I just want to look at one of the neural mechanisms that the brain may use and which Buonomano describes, for example, in detecting the amount of time between speech sounds or musical notes, though it may not be the only mechanism in operation in those domains. It's called interval selectivity based on short-term synaptic plasticity. Let's walk through now how this works, one step at a time. First, synaptic plasticity is the term for the fact that connections between neurons, the synapses, can be strengthened or weakened. This is the cellular underpinning of memory. It's often expressed in the adage, neurons that fire together wire together, meaning that the strengths of synapses strengthen with use. This can occur through a variety of mechanisms. Some persist in the long term, the most dramatic of which is the growth of entirely new connections from one neuron to another. but others are more short-lived. For example, imagine two neurons with a one-way connection between them, such that there is a sender neuron and a receiver. If the sender neuron fires, that is equivalent to saying that it sends chemicals to the receiver neuron, which make it slightly more likely to fire by bringing its voltage closer to the threshold required for firing to occur. Now, let's say that the receiver neuron requires a change of at least 2 millivolts to fire. Let's also say that when the sender neuron fires, it produces a change of 1 millivolt in the receiver, and that the voltage returns to normal after 50 milliseconds. So, if the sender neuron fires and then fires again within 50 milliseconds, then the receiver neuron will reach its threshold of 2 millivolts and it will also fire. If instead the sender neuron fires after 50 milliseconds, it will not produce a big enough change in the receiver neuron to make it fire. In other words, this simple dynamic represents a neuronal timer that detects intervals of 50 milliseconds or less. Now, let's further stipulate that the strength of the signal sent by the sender neuron will be reduced if its second firing occurs less than 50 milliseconds from the first. That could happen, for example, because the number of chemicals sent by the sender neuron is reduced, because it takes time to resynthesize these chemicals prior to each firing. In other words, the sender neuron will cause a change in voltage significantly less than 1 millivolt on its second firing because the first firing depleted the number of chemicals that could be sent to the receiver neuron and thus reduced the signal received by that neuron. That would allow the simple circuit to detect precisely 50 millisecond intervals, no more, no less. That dynamic may be used by the brain to calculate the timing between words in a sentence or musical notes, or even finer grained timing tasks. It may seem too simple, but if you imagine increasing the number of neurons and the complexity of connections and adding in inhibitory neurons, the sophistication of this kind of circuit in its ability to detect intervals between stimuli is greatly increased. Okay, next up is the tip. This one's about what's called the Kappa and tau effects. Okay, so this week, I want you to be aware of a cognitive bias called the Kappa effect, as well as the inverse phenomenon, the tau effect. Just so you know, this comes from Buonomano's book, which, as I said, I'll discuss in more detail later. Both of these effects refer to a quirk of how our brain uses the distance between two events to influence its estimate of the time elapsed between those two events. For example, say you're standing on the 50-yard line at the exact center of a football field. With you are 3 friends, all standing on the sideline, and you are facing that sideline. One is at the 0-yard line to your left, one at the 50 right in front of you, and the other at the 0-yard line on your right. Now say the guy on the left claps his hands, and 5 seconds later, the person at the 50-yard line claps her hands. Next, the person on the left once again claps his hands, and 5 seconds later, the person on the right, but not the one in the middle, claps his hands. If you did not know what the interval was in either case, and if you had no way of timing it, but you were nevertheless asked how much time elapsed between the left and middle person's clapping, as well as how much elapsed between the left and right person's clapping, you would likely estimate that the time between the left and middle was shorter than the time between the left and right, because the distance is longer between the left and right. In other words, the distance between events can bias our estimate of how much time has elapsed between them, with greater distances making us more likely to estimate a greater time interval, and shorter distances making us more likely to estimate shorter time intervals. That's the Kappa effect. Interestingly, we also do the opposite. When two events are at a fixed distance from each other, we will estimate that distance to be longer if the duration between the events is increased. For example, if the guy on the left side of the field claps and then the guy in the middle claps 10 seconds later, we will estimate the distance between them to be longer than if the interval was only 5 seconds. Of course, we would have to erase the yard lines on the field for that to occur. Otherwise, we would just be looking at how far they are objectively. Anyway, this is just to say that our brains not only use the objective times and distances, but also rules of thumb For example, that events separated in space are likely to be separated in time, in order to estimate times and distances between events. How can you guard against this bias? Well, like many cognitive biases, you can rely on objective measuring devices rather than your own intuition when timing or estimating distances. All right, next up in this episode is the book recommendation. And so let's get to that. All right, so as I mentioned, this week's book is Your Brain is a Time Machine, The Neuroscience of Physics and Time by UCLA neuroscientist Dean Buonomano. Buonomano's main argument is that the brain uses many different types of neural clocks and timers in order to accomplish the many feats of timing and time-telling that we so often take for granted, an idea he calls the multiple clocks principle. Above, I described a couple of the many mind-bending facts put forth in this book. He covers neuroscience and psychology topics like how timing is built into neural circuitry, how psychoactive drugs like marijuana affect our perception of the passage of time, why there are no neurological conditions that result both in the absence of the ability to appreciate music and, for example, learn to blink at the right time in response to tone, and why humans may be the only animal to mentally time travel, just to name a few examples. Yet he also dives into the physics of time and the history of the study of time, describing different theories and the evidence for them regarding the ultimate nature of time. He even looks at some of the overlap in the study of time in the mind and time in the universe, such as an endearing relationship that he describes between two intellectual giants of the 20th century, Albert Einstein and the child psychologist Jean Piaget, revealing that Piaget was influenced to study how children perceive time thanks to questions posed to him by Einstein. Buonomano writes with clarity, never bogging you down in too many details, but he is not afraid of subjecting the reader to a little math when necessary. I strongly recommend this book if you have ever wondered about the nature of time, how your brain interacts with it, or any of the topics that join these two areas of inquiry. All right, next up is a quote from that very book. Quote, "Telling time is a skill we share with all animals, but what makes Homo sapiens unique is the ability to transcend nature's capricious ways by peering into the future and shaping it to meet our needs. But mental time travel is a gift and a curse." Dean Buonomano. All right, so throughout the book, he describes neural mechanisms common to many animals that can be used to tell time in one way or another. Near the end, however, he argues that we humans, and perhaps the great apes to some extent, are alone in our ability to mentally project ourselves into the future. He points to experiments that seem to indicate that other creatures don't do this, but I must say that some of the criteria used to evaluate this in animals is rather arbitrary, not to mention that we can't actually ask other animals what they're thinking about. I recommend the book Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are by the primatologist Frans de Waal, as it led me to a somewhat opposite conclusion, namely that many intelligent creatures do this kind of thing fairly often. Anyway, regardless of where you land on the question of which species can mentally time travel, Buonomano's more personally relevant point is certainly true, that, quote, mental time travel is a gift and a curse. It's a gift because anyone who has planned for the future and benefited from those plans will tell you, imagining what will happen in the future and then devising ways of exploiting that prediction to better your circumstances is indispensable in modern life. For example, we get good grades so we can get into college, so we can get a degree, so we can get a satisfying and well-paying job that increases our standard of living. Yet, as anyone with any kind of anxiety issue can tell you, mental time travel to the future can be a curse as well. Worry is often a greater source of suffering than the very thing we are worrying about. We imagine catastrophic futures that are unlikely to pass unless we make a series of terrible decisions that we are unlikely to make. We overgeneralize about present conditions and imagine that the future will be just as painful as the present. This bias is partly justified, as it's much easier for things to fall apart or get worse than for them to stay together or get better. But that assumes we are not actively working to improve or maintain whatever we're talking about. We must learn balance. We must imagine a bright future while planning for contingencies that could throw us off track and how to deal with them. We must enjoy the present moment, knowing that things could change for the worse, but that our anticipation of that change is often much worse than the change itself. And this leads me to my final point, my thoughts. Lately, I've been thinking about how I use my limited time in life. It is so easy to fall into a pattern of thinking only about the future, of enjoying the dopamine rush that occurs when we anticipate long-term rewards of our current hard work. As I mentioned earlier, this is important if you want to accomplish anything in life, if you want a certain job, or to make a certain amount of money, or to do anything else that requires planning and effort. The problem is when we lose sight of that point. What is the end goal? I've noted in a video about setting goals that we need to set the right kinds of goals, which upon completion actually make us happy rather than making us frantically search for another arbitrary goal to pursue. In that video, I noted that there are at least 7 factors that can help us choose the right goals. First, you should choose meaningful goals that bring you a sense of purpose. Second, goals that are internally driven, those that promote good health, relationships, meaningful work, self-improvement, and helping others, are more likely to make you happy upon completing them than externally driven ones, like pursuing status or money for the lone reason of increasing the number of dollars in your bank account. Third, breaking a big goal into smaller goals will help you maintain motivation over time. Fourth, taking calculated risks in order to improve your situation is more satisfying than successfully avoiding failure by avoiding those same risks. Fifth, being deprived or hungry for the result of completing the goal will, somewhat obviously, make you more likely to enjoy it when you do complete it. Sixth, choosing your own goals rather than merely accepting those imposed upon you by your parents or surrounding culture is very often more satisfying, not least due to the other factors mentioned here. And finally, seventh, choose goals whose tasks are enjoyable and ideally give you a flow experience. Flow is that state of mind where time seems to drop away, where we're fully engrossed in what we're doing, and where our performance goes way up. All right, well, that is it for today's newsletter, today's episode. And I really just want to thank you so much for watching. The link for the book that I mentioned is below. And just so you know, everything I just said about goals is based on research into this kind of thing, specifically from the researcher Joseph Sirgy. So if you're interested in goal setting, check out my video on goals and some of the references there. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. As always, this channel is brought to you by the Diamond Mind Foundation, and this video was written and produced by me, Andrew Cooper Sansone. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.